In Dr. Carolyn L. Mazlumi and Michael Cummings are next on the program. And while they're getting settled in, I want to introduce you first to Carolyn. She's going to interview Michael for our QSOS project. Dr. Mazlumi is a historian, curator, author, lecturer, artist, mentor, founder, and facilitator. And that's just a short list. She has left her mark on many lives, including mine. From founding the African American Quilt Guild of Los Angeles in 1981 to, in 1985, founding the Women of Color Quilters Network. Mazlumi has been at the forefront of educating the public about the diversity of interpretation, styles, and techniques among African American quilters, as well as educating a younger generation of African Americans about their own history through quilts the Women of Color Quilters Network members create. Carolyn serves on the Quilt Alliance Board of Directors, and we are proud to have her demonstrating the Quilters SOS Save Our Stories Oral History Project today by conducting an interview with New York artist and quilt maker Michael Cummings. Great, they're all set up. QSOS as a project will turn 20 years old in 2019. It started in 1999. And as we approach this milestone, our focus is on making the 1,000 plus interviews in this collection more accessible and more useful. If you would like to be a part of this process, there are many ways for you to volunteer, and we'd love to hear from you. You can speak to us at the registration desk, leave us your name, your contact information. We need help with data entry. What we're doing is trying to transfer all of the video or the cassettes, the old cassette tapes, into digital audio files, and then put information in a database so that it can all be accessed online easier. So if that's up your alley, let us know. If you have a background in data entry or database systems, or you're just interested in getting into that collection, let us know. We'd love to have your help. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Carolyn, for you to say a few words about Michael before you begin. Okay, thank you both.
Okay, I'm here. I'm here to interview Michael Cummings, one of my favorite artists.
One thing I forgot.
Sorry.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Great. Anyway, I'm here to interview Michael Cummings, one of my absolute favorite artists. Michael is a formerly trained artist, and I have to say the very first piece of art I saw by you was a painting. He's been quilting over 40 years, and very vibrant, very exciting quilts. So, I want to ask Michael, first of all, to talk a little bit about the quilt that's up here on the stage.
The quilt on stage here is called African Jazz number 10. It's one of 12 quilts in a series that I made in 1990. It's 9 feet tall and 6 feet wide. All the quilts in the series are that size. And it came about, I was inspired to do this particular composition because I had bought a poster a few months before I started this series, and it was a photograph of 3 jazz musicians playing in South Africa. The photograph dated about 1950-something. And I was really fascinated by the poster because the image, they were slightly angled, and there was smoke-filled room, and the shadows on the faces of the performers created a mystifying sort of look. And I looked at it and thought there were opportunities for me to make a quilt. So I bought it and took it home, and for months I just kind of played in my mind with the idea because I do a lot of visualization before I start a quilt. I don't draw in advance or do any sketching. I just go from my mind to the fabric with a piece of chalk and start drawing. And I don't use measurements too much. It's sort of an organic process. And I just draw, put the fabric down, and I feel like I'm making a puzzle or something like that. So anyway, I bought the poster, brought it home in 1990. I decided to start this series, and in doing that, I had already taken a class on Yoruba culture. So I was familiar with African masks. I collect African masks. So it was easy to transform the narrative in the photograph into a fantasy sort of outdoor environment, which I did. And each quilt has a different mask on the performers. And you have a piano player, horn player, and a bass player. And some of the compositions, I have birds or plants or different sort of lizards or something like that moving around on them. And this quilt, after it was finished, this was number 10. And I came to this quilt and I minimized the colors because up until the 9th quilt I had layers and layers of color. And I was sort of like saturated with color. And I said, well, let me back off and relax and just use the basic 2 or 3 colors. And that's how I achieved this particular look. But also, the piano player in particular, I had thought that the head, the back of his head was sort of boring. So I had a Janus mask, so I put a face on the back of the head of the piano player. And I thought that made it more interesting. And so when it was all finished, I went on to make 2 more quilts. I was kind of pushed by friends to continue making quilt after quilt because I thought I was going to make 4. Then people said 6. Then they said 8, then 9, then 12, make an even dozen. So that's what I did. And then since that time, after the first year I made the quilt, Hallmark Cards picked up the image and they put it on a note card. And it was very popular in its sales. And then also one of the quilts went into the music library at City College here up in Harlem. Okay. And also there's one at Michigan State University Art Museum, and there are several in collections of private collectors.
That was my next question because I've been curating your shows, curating exhibitions with your work in it for almost 30 years now.
Right.
And for those that don't know, Michael's work is in many museum and private and corporate collections around the United States. So I wanted people to know where the quilts in this particular series, which institutions they went to.
Just a side note, I took this composition and made it into a quilt for Absolute Vodka.
Right, yes.
And so the quilt is in the, the Spirits Museum in Stockholm, Sweden.
Yes.
And what I did was I took out the piano player and I substituted him for a bottle of vodka. And so that quilt's there.
And for those that don't know, Absolute I don't know if they still do it, but they choose an artist every so often
I was among
their
14 at the time, that particular year, 1997.
Fabulous, absolutely. How did you become involved in making quilts?
Okay. It was an accident.
I'm sure. Okay.
Okay.
Tell us about it.
All right. I live in New York City, and I was working for the Department of Cultural Affairs. And at that time, I was tech director. And so that department planned all the public events in parks and cultural institutions. And we had an event at the American Craft Museum on 53rd Street, also known now as the Museum of Art and Design. And on 53rd Street, we had a banner making event, which we hired a quilter who he actually made wall hangings. And he had a display of his work in the museum, and we invited families to come in to make banners. And at the end of the week, we were going to have a parade around Fifth Avenue. And the staff was asked to make a banner. And at that time, that was when I first picked up fabric to consider some sort of art composition. I didn't know how to sew. And so after I pinned everything down, I didn't want to use glue. So somebody said, sew it. And I said, I don't know how to sew. So I took it to a tailor, and they wanted $100 to sew something that I hadn't paid more than $10 for fabric. And then I took it to a woman I knew that made artsy clothes in Soho. She wanted to teach me how to use a sewing machine, and I thought that was a very scary sort of idea. So I backed away from that. And so eventually I just went home and did what they call a running stitch, and went around each piece of the applique and did a running stitch on it. And then from there, I went back to the museum, to the resource library, and the director, Paul Smith at the time, kind of coached me on what books to take out for stitching and embroidery, and then told me that I could come back with my samples to show him, and he kind of critiqued things for me. And that's how I started off into quilting. But initially I was making wall hangings before quilting.
And I must say, the quilts that you brought here today are small compared to the quilts that you usually make. The quilts are massive, because the ones that I've worked with have been well over 8, 9, 10 feet plus.
Right.
So is that a favorite size that you like? You like working large as opposed to
Well, I work
working
on the
small?
floor. I crawl around on the floor and cut and pin, and then I drag it up to my sewing machine, which I call my dance partner. And so the floor, the studio has been 15 feet square, but it's kind of getting cluttered with chairs and other things, so the floor is shrinking. However, I do like to work in a large size. And I guess my average might be 7 to 8 feet tall and about average of 6 to 7 feet wide. Yeah.
Do you still have your first quilt?
Yes, I do. I was working on an archival project a few years ago, and I pulled it out to photograph it and put it in my archives. So I still have it
myself. Okay. Can you tell the audience what inspires you? What inspires you to make the quilts that you make?
Well, there's a list of things, not any one direction or one thing. Current events, history, just a song could promote me to do something. Like I have a quilt called I'll Fly Away and Take My Brother Home. Those were inspired by songs. And then I have quilts that were inspired by music. I have one called Satin Doll, and I wrote on the quilt all the names of jazz singers that I admired, and I have that. But it's across the spectrum. It could be anything, just emotionally might affect me. One of my early quilt series was the Haitian boat people, and looking on TV and reading in the papers about how the Haitians were trying to come across on rafts and everything and drowning, that affected me a lot. So I wanted to make a statement about that. So it could be politics, a lot of different things.
One of the things that I've heard here today, where people have come up and asked, can you introduce me to Michael? And everybody says, oh, he's so quiet. In looking at your quilts, the quilts from day one have been so vibrant.
Right.
I mean, just absolutely vibrant with color, and there's a lot of movement and excitement in them, and especially a bevy of various materials. So can you let us know how you acquire, where you find the materials that are in your quilts? I would say most of the quilts are, to me, like three-dimensional because they have so many, the surface design on them is intense.
Well, I have to start off with, once upon a time in Manhattan, there was an abundance of fabric stores from uptown to downtown. And now they're disappeared practically because of real estate costs and being bumped out. The last sort of fortress that I go down to where there's an abundance, or has been in the Soho area, where there are some holdouts of fabric stores. And I don't even know if they're there any longer. But I now go to the fabric district from below 42nd Street down to practically FIT. There's a lot of fabric stores, and so I shop there now. But I don't have a particular one, and I'm one of those impulse shoppers. So if I see a fabric, I might buy a yard or a half a yard and then keep it for a year or two before I use it.
Okay, but most of the quilts are more than just the fabric. You have so many found pieces on your quilt.
Right.
Like dresses, and I've seen pieces of carpet, rugs, and all kinds of stuff on
Well,
your
a lot of
quilt,
it's
so-
improvisation, too.
Okay.
I kind of add that into the element because, again, I visualize the idea, but once it starts to take shape, it's on the floor, pieces are coming together, and then I might see where I could add something to make it pop a little bit more, and so I might add it. It's not in the master plan, but it just kind of happens.
Do you have any favorite techniques that
Yes,
you
I
use
do.
to
I
make
do.
your quilts?
All my quilts are zigzag stitching, which I love, and that was the type of process that the banner,
applique.
well, the banner maker in the first show at the American Craft Museum, he did zigzag, and that's how I picked up that habit. If I hadn't seen his work, I might have been doing something else altogether. But he did a zigzag stitch, and in doing the zigzag stitch, he actually used colored threads to kind of complement the fabric. So I try to do that also. And then also, applique is my standard way that I construct my quilts. And I really enjoy that process.
Have you ever made any pieced quilts, any geometric
In the very
quilts?
beginning, I wanted to see what quilting was about, so I did standard quilts for about 6 months or so. I took some standard patterns, and I made quilts. I made the borders. I got my measuring tape and stick and all that sort of stuff, and I said, enough of this. I'll just do my sort of free-form, organic sort of thing of constructing. And so, again, I just draw by freehand. I don't really measure.
Tell us about your studio. Do you have a home studio, or do you work outside? You have an outside studio?
No.
Where do you
I
work?
work in my home. I bought a brownstone about 30 years ago up in Harlem. And on the parlor floor in the back, it's 15 feet square. And I have shelving for fabric and finished work. And in the middle of the floor is where I actually construct my quilts. And again, I work on the floor. And then someone recently gave me knee pads because I was complaining about my knees, and so they help. And then I take whatever I'm working on to my dance partner, and we start sewing
In that same room?
in that same room. And I also have a personal trainer, and my personal trainer I've had for years, and all that is, it's a 60-minute timer. Because I've had a 9-to-5 job for 30-something years, so I would come home to quilt, and time was very precious. So in order to keep focus, not daydream, and to actually kind of review what I've accomplished, anytime the bell rings off at 60 minutes, I would review what I've accomplished, what I want to accomplish, and then I start up the timer again. So I call that my personal trainer, because it keeps me in check. Keeps me in check.
Are there any quilt groups or art groups that you belong to?
Oh, yeah. There's been a series. I first started with Empire Quilters. They were a very friendly, nurturing group, and I met new beginning quilters. And so that was a really great place to be. And then after that, I joined your group, Women of Color Quilting Networks. And then after that, I joined the Studio Art Quilt Associates. And then after that, I belonged to an uptown group now called Harlem Needle Arts. I belong to that group. And I think I'm leaving out someone, but yeah, those are some of the groups I belong to.
That's a lot. That's a lot. What do you think makes a quilt successful? What do you think, what do you think makes a quilt successful?
Well, construction, surface design, the imagination that went into it, the passion that went into it, and then it also, successful would mean possibly to a large audience, so it has to appeal to a large audience in some way, emotionally, to make it successful, I think.
Have you made quilts or a quilt or quilts that you felt after finishing them, completing them, that were not necessarily successful?
Let's see, maybe a little bit, but I try to bring it to a completion. Well, I tell everybody, I let the quilt tell me when it's finished.
Right.
And so I try to finish it, and if I don't think it's finished, I'll go back and work on it a little bit more. But I don't try to publicly show something that I'm not satisfied with.